Yo, what's up guys? It's your boy Kodiak here, and welcome back to the second video of Debunking OC Fallacy, Part 2. Okay, so let's start off with the fact that OC Fallacy is not a formal logic whatsoever, as it is instead an informal logic. Now, the difference between formal logic and informal logic is that formal means based on an argument involving deductively necessary relationships and including the use of syllogisms and mathematical symbols, while informal logic means the study of reasoning and argumentation and everyday language and context, focusing on evaluating the strength and validity of arguments based on their content and context rather than their purely formal structure. And why is OC an informal logic rather than formal? Here's why. The OC fallacy is categorized as an informal fallacy because it does not violate the structure of formal or deductive reasoning, but instead relies on assumptions, context, and subjective interpretations. It arises in fictional debates, particularly in fan communities. When someone accuses another inventing overpowered feats for an original character without sufficient narrative buildup or evidence, this fallacy is not grounded in logical syllogisms or mathematical proof like formal logic. Instead, it depends on informal principles such as credibility, consistency, and audience perception. Since it often overlaps with appeals to imagination or burden of proof and varies depending on the standards of the debate community, OC fallacy clearly falls under the category of informal logic. And also, I'll give another example too, say for instance, your original character just destroyed the multiverse in one punch. That doesn't count because they, don't have a full backstory or 30,000 words of lore. So I'm calling OC fallacy, that's what they say. But here's the thing. This is informal because it's based on community expectations and subjective standards, not a strict logical contradiction. The reasoning isn't flawed in structure. It's disputing this credibility in narrative development, making it a judgmental call, or judgment call, not a formal logical error. So the second slide talks about why, what OC fallacy falls under appeals to common sense. When someone claims OC fallacy is logical because it clearly shows it sounds logical, they're committing an appeal to common sense, an informal fallacy that relies on gut feeling over critical reasoning. Just because something seems obvious or makes sense in your head doesn't make it logically valid. Logic isn't built on vibes, it's built on structure, evidence, and formal principles. Declaring OC fallacy as logical without proving it through formal logic is just projecting personal belief as fact. That's not an argument, that's just comfort thinking dressed up as logic. In reality, it's a subjective opinion with no binding authority, especially in fictional debates where authority, intent, and creative freedom reign. Now for the third slide, when people try to compare fairness rules between fictional debates and sports, it's a false equivalence. And here's why. So comparing fictional versus battles to real-world sports is a false equivalence fallacy, as it attempts to equate fundamentally different systems. Also, sports operate under universally agreed upon physical laws, measurable metrics, and standardized rules enforced by governing bodies, making fairness objective and enforceable. In contrast, fictional debates revolve around authorial intent, subjective scaling, and narrative-driven feats that are very widely in scope of logic and consistency. And to treat a fictional OC's feats like a competitive athlete's stats is also an appeal to common sense fallacy, assuming that fairness and storytelling must mirror fairness in real life, which is a subjective, culturally biased assumption. Moreover, invoking OC fallacy in this way often turns into a no true Scotsman fallacy, where only characters with a certain amount of lore or popularity are considered valid. Well, regardless of their feats or documented feats, fiction does not owe elegance to sports like fairness. It only owes consistency to its attentional or eternal logic and authorial vision. The fourth slide talks about, it commits a couple other fallacies too. And let me explain it. Here's why. So, the OC fallacy often commits the logical flaw of moving the goalposts, where the standards for a valid verse are arbitrarily shifted to disqualify original content. So, like, for instance, someone may claim an OC fallacy is invalid because it doesn't have enough feeds. Then, when those feeds are provided, they demanded 10,000 words of lore, then 30,000, then a full plot, then an anime adaptation, and so on. And so, this constantly changing benchmark reveals that the criteria are not objective, but instead based on arbitrary and subjective standards. So, the definition of what counts becomes personal opinion rather than a consistent rule. So, as a result, OC fallacy relies not on logic, but on exclusion by ever-changing, self-imposed standards designed to dismiss rather than evaluate fairly. Now, for the fifth slide, we're going to talk about Versus Battles and why it's a false authority. And we all know Versus Battles is a fan website. As you can see, like right here, as the name is literally called fandom for a reason. And let me explain why it falls under false authority. So, Versus Battles is a classic example of an appeal to false authority because it presents itself as a definitive standard for fictional power scaling. Despite being a fan-run website with no official or academic credibility, the site was created and is maintained by internet users who are not professional authors, philosophers, or logicians, but rather fans who establish their own arbitrary rules, such as the OC fallacy or the 30,000 word and requirement for validity. These are not recognized in any formal field of logic, debate, or literature. Treating Versus Battles as an absolute authority is misleading because it creates the illusion of objectivity while enforcing subjective and inconsistent criteria. Ultimately, it's just a popular fan community, not a governing body, and should not be treated as a final authority in fictional debates.
So any further ado, guys, I'll see you guys next time. And make sure to subscribe to my channel, like and share, and y'all have a good one.